Settle in. Professor Whiskerton here. The year before us is 1789. Two revolutions were born this year. They shared one idea and almost nothing else. April the 30th, 1789, New York City. George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall on Wall Street and placed his right hand on a Bible. He had received every electoral vote, all 69 of them, the only unanimous presidential election in American history. And yet Washington, by every account, was not triumphant. He was anxious. He wrote to a friend the week before that he felt as a man about to be executed. Because what he was doing had no precedent, no king, no parliament, no emperor, the United States had decided to try something genuinely new, a republic with an elected head bound by a written constitution who would eventually step aside. The stepping aside was the hardest part to believe. Every decision Washington made that first year, how to address the president, what ceremonies were appropriate, whether the president bowed or shook hands, became a template, because there was no template. He was inventing the role as he filled it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, an older nation was conducting a very different experiment. July the 14th, 1789, Paris. The Bastille had stood on the eastern edge of the city for centuries, a fortress, a prison, and above all, a symbol. If the king wished you gone, you went there. No trial, no charges announced in public. No one would necessarily know where you had disappeared to. That was the point. On that morning, a crowd of somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people marched on it. The garrison, a mix of aging veterans and Swiss mercenaries, held on for several hours. Eventually, the gates were lowered. The crowd flooded in. Inside the great symbol of royal despotism, they found 7 prisoners, 4 counterfeiters, 2 men committed by their own families for reasons the historical record politely describes as unclear, and 1 Englishman who appeared to be genuinely unsure why he was there at all. The fortress that had haunted the imagination of Paris for generations held 7 people no one had ever heard of. The revolution's first act of liberation freed the paperwork. And yet one should not underestimate the power of a symbol. The Bastille was not torn down because of who was inside. It was torn down because of who might have been. 6 weeks after the Bastille fell, the National Constituent Assembly published 17 articles, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Liberty, equality before the law, the sovereignty of the people, freedom of speech and of the press, the presumption of innocence, the right to resist oppression. These principles had been articulated by Enlightenment philosophers for decades. But this was the first time a functioning government, a government with power, with an army, with courts, signed its name to them and called them the foundation of rule. Consider the year. Roughly 70% of France was illiterate. The document was posted in public squares and proclaimed from lecterns to crowds who could not read a word of it. And yet they came to hear it. Something about it mattered beyond the text. The Declaration would go on to become, in various forms, the blueprint for constitutions across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Article 9, the presumption of innocence, is now so embedded in legal systems worldwide that we have largely forgotten someone had to write it down for the first time. Someone did in 1789. The assembly was practical as well as idealistic. and among its practical concerns was the question of execution. In 1789, a physician named Joseph Ignace Guillotine brought a proposal to the floor. He was not a cruel man. He was, by the standards of his era, a progressive one. Before the machine, French executions were stratified by class. Nobles received the sword, considered swift and dignified. Common people were hanged, broken on the wheel, or subjected to procedures that history has mercifully agreed not to describe in detail. Guillotine's argument was simple. The machine would end this inequality. Every condemned person, regardless of station, would receive the same swift, painless death. The assembly agreed. The device was constructed and tested and declared by medical observers to be humane. It was used to execute between 15,000 and 40,000 people during the years that followed. Among them, the king who had ruled when it was approved, and the very architects of the revolution who had championed it. As for Guillotin himself, he survived the terror. He spent the remainder of his life campaigning to have his name removed from the device. He was unsuccessful. He died in 1814, still attached in name at least to the blade. By autumn, Paris had grown hungry. On the morning of October the 5th, women began gathering in the market squares of the city, not to shop. The price of bread had become, for ordinary working families, a kind of slow catastrophe. By 1789, a French laborer might spend between 70 and 90% of a week's wages on bread alone, and that was when bread was available. Between 5,000 and 10,000 women assembled, and they marched 20 kilometers through October rain to the Palace of Versailles, armed, organized, and completely clear about what they wanted. They entered the palace grounds. They forced an audience with the king. Louis XVI agreed to open the royal grain stores and distribute food. But the crowd did not consider this sufficient. They made him leave. Louis XVI returned to Paris, accompanied by the crowd, escorted by the National Guard, and took up residence in the Tuileries Palace. He would never see Versailles again. The storming of the Bastille is the image everyone remembers, the thunder and the symbol. But it was this march, wet, cold, organized, led by women demanding bread, that physically removed the king from the seat of royal power. Sometimes the most consequential revolution happens on foot, in the rain. And so 1789 drew to a close, a year that had posed a single question: who holds power, and by what right? Washington answered with a ballot and a handshake. Paris answered with something louder. Before we close the lecture hall, which of these moments surprised you most? And if you recall something this lecture missed, the floor is yours. Tell me in the comments what else 1789 held. If there is a year you wish to revisit, name it. The next lecture may well be yours to request. Subscribe, and you will not miss it. And that was 1789. Thank you for watching. Class dismissed.